Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, and a very special person actually, because Ibrahim is also not just a speaker, but also one of the organizers of MenaML. And in fact, he worked to lead most of the program you are seeing this week. So very, very important person. So without further ado, Ibrahim is a research scientist at the Frontier AI unit at Google DeepMind, based out of Zurich, Switzerland. Prior to joining Google, he founded and led the advanced analytics team at Saudi Aramco and managed the company's enterprise analytics program. He holds an MSc degree in electrical engineering from Stanford University and a PhD in computer science from KAUST. Please join me in welcoming Ibrahim. Thank you.
Thank you, Nassim. Okay, welcome everyone again. So we've heard today about reasoning in LLMs. So that was about how to get LLMs to reason in human language. So what I'm going to be talking about is how to get LLMs to reason, but not in human language. After all, why should we constrain it? Right? And one insight why this might be possible is shown in the picture on the left. So what I'm going to be talking about is what does this picture of a leaf have to do with reasoning? Okay. So the leaf, the structure on the left, this is what we normally call a fractal. It's a structure that repeats itself at different scales. So if you zoom into the picture, you will see the original picture again. And what I'm going to be talking about in the first part is how language has a self-similar structure as well. And then in the second part, we'll talk about like how do we use this to evaluate LLMs. And in the last part is how do we use this fractal structure of language to improve the structure of language models. And basically, how do we get them to reason, but not in human language? Okay, so let's get started with fractals in language. Okay, so we've heard this already. So next token prediction, it has been incredibly amazing. We've seen all of these amazing capabilities in context learning, reasoning, theory of mind, and so on. And if you think about this a little bit, I mean, it's very amazing that there is a distribution somewhere out there that we're trying to learn, which can unlock all of these capabilities. So the question is, what does that distribution have? What enables some of these capabilities to emerge? Okay. And before we can answer that question, let's first think of, okay, how do we represent language in the first place so that we can analyze it? And one way we can do this is to look into the information theoretic complexity of language. I don't know how many of you are familiar with information theory, so I'll try to briefly maybe explain it. The idea is, let's say you start with the text shown here in the picture, the quick brown fox, etc. Now, for every one of these tokens, let's say that every word is a token here, we can assign a number of bits. This is basically the log perplexity score that's assigned to that particular token. It's the information theoretic complexity of that particular token. Now, this number of bits is just a number, so we could plot this over time. So we have a time series shown here in the middle that just basically evolves over time. And now the question is, okay, what can we what can we infer by studying this time series? Okay. So the first thing we learn by looking into this is long-range dependence. Now we know that intuitively that this holds in language. I mean, we all read books, like the last chapter of the book still depends on the very beginning of the book. So there is this long-range dependence over time. But the good thing about using fractals is we can quantify this. So you could come up with an actual metric that says, this is how much long-range dependence we have in language. I'll talk about how to do this. And the second thing is self-similarity. So if we look into this time series over time, this is an actual document shown here in the middle. If you take any region and you zoom into it and then you magnify it, you will actually see almost the same statistical behavior. So it's not that language, as you zoom in or zoom out, it becomes different. It's almost the same. And intuitively, we know that this should hold because the way we summarize, let's say, a book in a few paragraphs, we also use language to summarize the book. So those few paragraphs, which are the summary of a huge book, they follow the same structure as language, right? So that's why we have this self-similar structure in language. And these are very interesting things because they tell us a little bit about the complexity of language. Language does not become easier if you think about it from a high scale. And you cannot just do a reasonable job of predicting if you think about it as a table lookup because of this long-range dependence. Okay. So we have these two properties. Again, I'm going to mention them a few times. Long-range dependence on one axis and self-similarity on the other axis. But just to give you an intuition, you can think of these. Like, so the one quadrant on the left, the top left, this is when you have both. So you have long-range dependence because increments in the process, they tend to be followed by increments. So there is this dependence over time. And you have self-similarity because even if you zoom out or zoom in, you cannot tell them apart, right? But you also have other things. Like you could have a process that is self-similar, shown here at the bottom left, but there is no long-range dependence. So this is like, mathematically, this is called the fractional Brownian motion. And you could have other things as well. Language, what I'm going to be arguing is, it falls in the top left quadrant. So we have this long-range dependence and we have self-similarity. And these are very, interesting things that we will be able to use later. So how do we measure self-similarity? Intuitively speaking, now we know, if you remember the picture of the leaf, we know how to define self-similarity. If I have a geometric object, I could just zoom into a part of it and see the original shape or the original object, right? But how do we define this statistically for stochastic processes such as language? And there is a way to define this. Not going to walk quickly in details about the definition, but basically what I want to say is there is a power law relationship. If you show that this power law relationship holds, then you have a self-similar structure in language. And we show this here on the bottom right, that you do have this an almost perfect power law relationship in language, which shows that there is this self-similarity. And the slope of this line, this tells us how self-similar the process is. Okay? So that's the first thing. The interesting thing about all of this is this self-similarity in language is extremely robust. Okay? Now, today we use language models to measure this, but it's not really a property of the language model itself. It's a property of language. And the way we can show this is we could try different language models. So this work was done 2 years ago, so we have been using like old language models, like Palm and Palm 2. But generally, you will see that there is a general agreement among them. So that's a good thing, because that tells us that self-similarity is a property of language itself. The second thing is long-range dependence. How do we measure this? Now, there is an old technique. You can use the partial autocorrelation function, but don't worry about this, ignore this. We can use fractals to do this again. And the way to do this, the idea was developed by the hydrologist Hurst. He was studying the Nile River, discharges in the Nile River in the 1950s. And he noticed this long-range dependence in the level of discharges in the Nile. So he noticed that the level of discharge in the Nile River in 1 year somehow depends on what happened 10 or 20 years earlier. So he wanted to model this, and he came up with the Hurst exponent that can quantify this. Now, the definition is a bit technical. I'm not going to go over it, but just to give you an intuition, as I mentioned earlier, we say that we have long-range dependence if increments in the process tend to be followed by increments. So you have these regions where the process keeps going up, and then regions where it starts to go down, and so on. So this is long-range dependence, and we have this in language. Now, interestingly, in language, when we measure this, we found that the Hurst exponent is about 0.75. Now, I know that it's not easy to interpret this, but just to give you an intuition, what this 0.75 here is, it's a midway between processes that are completely unpredictable, completely random, and processes that are completely predictable. So we lie almost in the middle, perfectly in the middle. And this is interesting because even like in psychology and these processing-based theories of learning in children, they argue that generally to accelerate learning, like in children, you need to give them, like there is a sweet spot between simple, extremely simple exercises and extremely hard exercises that will accelerate learning. And we have this in language. And the other interesting thing is this number, 0.75, you see this all the time in nature. Like even in tree rings, if you were to look into the distances between rings in a tree, and you model this as a time series, you will find that you get also this Hurst exponent of about 0.75. So we have this long-range dependence in language as well. Okay? And one thing interesting is if you try to quantify this by domain, now, we can do this for math, we can do this for encyclopedic articles, etc. You will find that in math, we don't have this long-range dependence. And that's why I try to highlight this here at the top right. But this should not be surprising in hindsight, because if you look into the actual data sets, you will find that many of these math data sets are a bunch of exercises that are somewhat independent. So you could answer every exercise separately. That's why we don't have. Okay, so, that was a quick overview about fractals. Why would they be useful in the first place, right? So the first thing is that was very interesting, that was very surprising to us when we studied this, is that these fractals, they tell us something about the behavior of large language models. Now, when we evaluate large language models during pre-training, usually what we look into are the perplexity scores. These are very common metrics upstream, right? And there is a good reason for looking into perplexity scores. But the thing is, if you look into fractals as well as perplexity scores, they turn out to give us a much better prediction of downstream performance, of things like in math and reasoning and so on. Okay? So let me show you this. So here, this is the table. So here at the top table, so you have the correlation between perplexity scores upstream and downstream performance. We see a very good, strong correlation, as expected. If you just look into the Hurst exponent, you will find an even much stronger correlation with downstream performance. And if you just take the average, the simple average of the two, you will see an even stronger correlation with downstream performance. So they tell us more about the performance of large language models than just by looking into perplexity scores. And if we were to actually, what does this even mean? If you think, I want you to just think of it this way. Let's pretend that this is perplexity over time of a large language model. So you have one long text, and you plot the log perplexity scores over time using this large language models. Usually, the way we evaluate is we take the average perplexity score. So we look into the mean. These two curves, they have the same mean. But one of them, if you look at the one at the top, it has a bit more variance than the one at the bottom. The one at the bottom has more long-range dependence, or a higher Hurst exponent. And what we are saying here is the one at the bottom tells us that that particular language model is better than the language model in the top. And that's interesting because we usually ignore these second-order statistics when we evaluate language models. We usually just focus only on the mean, but there is more information about the performance than just their first-order statistics. Okay, so that was the first part. The second part is, so that was in language. What about large language models? How well do they replicate this fractal structure? So there are many research questions one could ask. So I'm listing here 4 of them. One is, do they replicate this fractal structure or not? If so, under what conditions? The second question is, okay, how sensitive are they to prompting? And the third thing is, these fractal parameters, do they correlate with the quality of the model? I'm talking about now post-trained models. And are some domains easier to synthesize than others according to these fractal parameters? So I'll just quickly go through each of these questions. So that maybe, but just before we do this, let's ask ourselves, Okay, why would language models be able to replicate the fractal structure, and why they wouldn't? So one argument for why they should is basically the chain rule. LLMs, when you train a language model autoregressively, that's basically the chain rule. So you should be able to approximate any distribution. But at the same time, one might argue that language models should not be able to replicate the structure of language because we don't write text autoregressively. We always think before, I hope, we think before we write, right? And so that's that we don't improvise text at a time. And in that case, if you work out mathematically what this means, you will find a mismatch. Okay, but let's see empirically which one it is. Well, the first thing is, it turns out that they do replicate the fractal structure, and not surprisingly, larger models are better. The second thing is, when it comes to prompting, we find that there is another double descent phenomena, meaning if I give the LLM more information, more context, more guidelines, etc., that doesn't always mean that they will give you better behavior, better in the sense that they replicate the structure of language. We found that they do give you improvement up to a point, then they start to get worse, then they start to get better. And for those of you who are familiar with statistical learning theory, with all of the literature on double descent, this might be familiar to you. It's because it's very similar to what has been observed over there. So that's an interesting thing. The other, which is the most interesting finding, perhaps, is that, again, these fractal parameters tell us something about the quality of the output of the LLM. So let's say I ask the language model to generate a long article. How do I evaluate the quality of the article? One way is to look into the perplexity scores, but that turns out to be a poor predictor of the quality. That's shown here on the top left. Really, there is no correlation. If you were to plot quality versus perplexity score, you will not see much correlation in this case. But if you look into the Hurst exponent, you will see a very strong correlation. So the closer your long-range dependence to that of natural language, the better the text is. So that was very interesting. And the last thing is, are some domains easier to synthesize than others? Yes. For example, encyclopedic articles are very easy to fabricate, but creative writing, like poetry, is hard. And the interesting thing here is, again, if you try to figure this out by looking into perplexity scores alone, you will not see a difference. You will get the impression that language models are doing as well in poetry as humans, if you look into only perplexity scores. But if you look into the fractal structure of both, you will see that there is a very big difference between the two. Okay, and this is, so part of what we did here is we also released like a data set if you are interested in studying these questions. So there is a big data set of synthetic text that you could use. Okay, now I'll get to the last part, which is reasoning, but not in human language, which is it's mainly inspired by what I talked about earlier about self-similarity in language. And the idea is, okay, so when we know that language is self-similar, can we somehow take this self-similarity and bake it into the architecture itself? And it turns out that we can do this, and that will actually give us a significant boost in performance. Okay, so intuitively, why should we actually, why would something like this matter? If we look into, let's say you have a sequence of tokens that's shown on the left. These are basically the raw tokens. Now, if you think about what happens in transformers, okay, we come up with higher level representations of those tokens, right? So you might, for example, I'm just simplifying things, you might encode some additional information about, for example, part of speech tagging, or you might add something about the entity or the position, etc. So as you go deeper into the architecture, you have higher level representations of those tokens. What self-similarity means is the model that you use to train, to predict the raw tokens, somehow you should be able to use it to predict these higher level representations as well. And So one way to actually do this, to make it into the architecture, is basically to loop some of the layers in the model. So we do something called parameter sharing. You take your model. Let's say my model here, I split it into two parts. One part is the first half of the model, block A. The second part is block B. And I could just loop some of these blocks. Okay, so probably have seen lots of works last year around these layer reusing or looping strategies. So there are many ways you can actually do this. The question now is, and the key fundamental question is, if we fix our training compute budget, do we actually gain anything by doing looping? And it turns out that, yes, we do gain a lot, but not any kind of looping would work. The way that would work is the one shown here in the third row, which we call recursive inference scaling, or RINS. And that basically takes the first half of the model, the first half, and loops it several times before you go to the second half of the model. And here, looping the first half matters, because if you try to do this in the second half, it will not work. If you try to loop the middle layers, it's not going to work as well as looping the first half. Okay, so I mentioned that, okay, the key question is we have to control for compute. Why? Why would it? Because if we don't control for compute, we might be misled. So let's say I take one of these architecture and I just look into the number of tokens. I fix my number of tokens, I train the model, and I find a significant improvement. That improvement could have come from the increased compute, because I'm now doing looping many times, not necessarily from the architecture itself. So we want to control for compute. And when we do that, now we see that, okay, maybe looping doesn't even help. Because if I don't loop, I might fall in the leftmost regime where I actually get to see more tokens. So that might give me a boost in performance. If I do a bit of looping, I loop a few of the blocks, I might be in the middle regime where I see a good number of tokens, or sorry, in the rightmost regime, I see a good number of tokens, but I don't do a lot at test time in terms of looping or recursive inference. Or I could be in the middle. So the question now is, which one would work? And as I mentioned earlier, looping the first half of the model is the right thing to do. Okay, so this is what we call recursive inference scaling. Now, there are a bit of technical details. For now, I'm not going to talk about it. There are some adapters, some projection layers that we also do. Don't worry about them for now. The main punchline is you get significant gains with fixed model parameters, so you're not changing the size of your model. And the important thing is you are not also changing your compute budget. You're training for the same amount of compute, for the same amount of training compute, and for the same model size, and we have a significant improvement in performance. That improvement comes from scaling test time, because now we are looping the model. You allow the model to reason, but in latent space, not in natural language. So there is no regret in this case. You're not going to lose anything. That's one of the other key things, the main advantages of this. Let's say you train the model with this recursive inference, but then you decide not to use it at this time. For whatever reason, you can't afford the extra compute at this time. You can disable it, and you're not going to lose anything. You will recover the performance of the baseline. And that's the very interesting thing. And the third thing is, we found that this doesn't just work well in language models, it also works well in vision language models as well. Things like SIGLib, for example. If you're familiar with them, it's a clip-style model. It works also extremely well over there, because those models, they also process language, so they also benefit from this improvement. Okay, so that's what I mentioned. You don't lose anything by doing this. You could also disable it at this time, and you're not going to lose anything in terms of performance. So this is a high-level pseudocode. Okay, maybe I could walk you through it quickly, but just to make sure that we are on the same page. So you define at the top, you define your model parameters. During inference, your forward pass is you loop based on a signature. For example, if your signature is, okay, loop the first half, you loop the first half of the model a fixed number of times, and then you go through stochastic. There are these technical details that we mentioned, like stochastic, dropout, and adapters. But that's it. You're not changing a lot. It's just a few lines of code that you add to your architecture. And this is just a brief summary about the improvement in performance. Now, we've compared this against like 50 other looping methods. You get significantly better performance, and the gap increases compared to the other methods as you train longer. So it scales with, it has these favorable scaling behaviors. And at the bottom, this is what I mentioned when I talked about SIGLIB. Like you also see a significant improvement if you do this in vision language models as well. Okay. Now, some few questions to ask. One is, okay, how many times should I do the loop? So the answer is basically smaller model, it depends on the size of your model. So smaller models would benefit more from looping than larger models, but all of them, they will eventually benefit from loops. The second thing is, do we get the improvement, if you're familiar with scaling laws, do we get the improvement from the asymptotic performance limits, or do we get the improvement by improving the scaling exponents? How fast does the model converge? And it turns out that we improve both. And the last question is, okay, does this work with the KV cache sharing? It's a very common technique today. And the answer is yes. You don't get the same amount of improvement, but you also get an improvement. Okay? So just to summarize the 3 key takeaways. So the first thing is there is a fractal structure in language that we can quantify. There is an old literature on fractals that we could use now to study natural language. For example, we could quantify long-range dependence with the Hurst exponent. We could quantify self-similarity and so on. And the other interesting thing is these fractals, they're not just some theoretical curiosity. You could actually use them to evaluate the performance of pre-trained language models. And the second thing is, the second part is in large language models, we saw that they also tend to replicate this fractal structure in language, which is a good thing. Larger models generally do better as expected. But also here again, we find that fractals, particularly the Hurst exponent, for measuring long-range dependence, gives us a new lens for evaluating the quality of the output of LLMs. So the closer you are to that of natural language, the better the quality of the text. And that's significantly better predictor of performance than just using perplexity scores. And the last thing is we could bake all of this into the architecture itself so that it can do this pseudo-reasoning in latent space. And that gives us a significant improvement in performance in both large language models and VLMs. Okay, that's it.